Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you very much for inviting me to be here with you and addressing this meeting and for the collaboration we have with EMBL from Iceland. And I just want to say that in this presentation, it will be kind of connecting our work sort of in the context of life in context sort of theme that Edith mentioned of how we as biologists are connecting with the biodiversity crisis, which is pretty obvious to all of us today, and in what way maybe we want to continue bringing in our work. And I will try to do this in a relatively combined manner, somewhat philosophical. And these are my co-authors. They're working with me at the museum, actually. So it's appropriate to start by looking at what biodiversity is. This is a session on biodiversity, and that is certainly a centerpiece in the discussion these days. And we use the definition, the comprehensive definition of the CBD UN Convention of Biological Diversity, which is very comprehensive. But the important thing about this definition is that it not only emphasizes differences among species, it also introduces differences within species, among molecules at all different stages. And more importantly, even it includes ecosystems, the inorganic world also. So it's very comprehensive. And maybe we can relate to simply the philosophical fact that diversity is the basis of all relations, and it is the basis of all systemic function, both of ecosystems and that of developmental systems that I will be bringing in quite a bit later on. So the fundamental reason why the diversity is valuable is that without it, there is no change. Without diversity, there are no choices. And then maybe finally on this slide, just emphasizing that we humans and our cultures are part of biodiversity. And this is something that is at center discussion by the United Nations, for example, today, highlighted in these reports of elevating the crisis of biodiversity and climate change. So policies to fight and reverse biodiversity loss have basically failed. And we maybe most dramatic example of that is the Aichi goal setting of the United Nations in 2010. That largely failed. And recent discussions, and many of you are aware of these discussions, they are calling for complete transformation to meet this crisis situation that we are in. And we are talking about transformation in the way biologists work and communicate, the social situation, the economically and philosophically, with highly ambitious plans. And this is pretty obvious from the agreements that were signed in Montreal on biodiversity in last December, so that you may be aware of. So the underlying theme in all of this, as I have already alluded to, is the massive need to reconnect man as a natural being. And I think this is very implicit in the life and context theme of the meeting, that we need to do this as well as scientists. And this is just to sort of illustrate that I'm not just saying this, this is actually in the reports, and they talk about war, humans are in war with nature. But if we just look at this citation from the COP15 agreement, that it is actually calling for that in 2050, humanity needs to be in harmony with Mother Earth. That's a rather tall order. So when we think about it, what can we contribute? How can our research help in fighting this biodiversity loss and meet all these extreme pressures that are operating from climate change in particular? And then maybe a rather harsh statement is just to make the point that biological approaches in the past have often been weak, using very static measures for biodiversity, for example. We evolutionary biologists are very frustrated about this because biodiversity is not just about species richness, but about evolution and change. And also there is, for geneticists, it's kind of a bit disturbing that there is this very broad focus on quantitative genetics rather than looking at the genetic process in its whole dimensions. So there is now a very clear call for a more functional process-based view of biodiversity. And it's also illustrated in the need to understand what we call nature-based approaches in building up ecosystems. Mind you, one of the decisions of this in this agreement that I mentioned in December was actually to restore 30% of Earth's disturbed ecosystems by 2030. So we better start to roll up our sleeves and understand what is going on in these systems. So here, I would say that ecologists and evolutionary and developmental biology and molecular biologists, as Detlef explained here about the purpose of this meeting really, is that we have a lot to say. We have a lot to contribute. And there has been a lot happening in this area in the last decades and only in the last few years that really can play an important role But we know also that many of this knowledge is not being necessarily applied in policies and education in society today. So this is something that we need to reverse and work with. And just to advertise, that some of these important findings are presented in books like this. Just look at the titles. And these are drawing attention to the understandings that our fields have brought forth, but are not necessarily being used so much in fighting biodiversity loss. So I'm just making a point. It's a provocating statement. And not only that, we have a number of very good publications and research which are directly addressing these issues in terms of how development and evolution, for example, can meet climate change. And but they're not necessarily being used. And I want to particularly draw attention, of course, as obvious, to the EMBL program from molecules to ecosystems, which is an admirable effort to really reverse this situation. And I think it is a real motivation to all of us to get our work together and work together to solve these issues. But pay attention also to the theme that when you think of molecules to ecosystems, you're also talking about integrating things and working in a very integrated way. And this is what we attempted to propose for our sort of studies in a paper in 2019 by drawing this sort of triangle framework of connecting ecology, evolution, and development. And I'm just going to explain this very quickly, and that if we just start by looking at the Devo part, we can think of that as a population of organisms with differing in phenotype that natural selection can then act on. So natural selection acts on phenotypes, remember. And it is this phenotype that are developing in each individual through some kind of developmental systems. And this happens very fast, much faster often than people think. And then some of this is returned to the next generation through heritable effects. And we know now that these heritable effects are not just genes. These are all non-genetic, epigenetic effects. And maybe most importantly, we also have evidence of within generation effect in terms of phenotypic plasticity and maternal effects at many different scales, from eco to devo, kicking off evolutionary processes. And maybe finally, this framework is just explaining that we have a feedback process of the phenotypic differences, both evolutionarily and developmentally, affecting the ecosystem. So the ecosystem, the environment, is implicitly connected with the organism in this way, and indicating that the organism is deciding its own environment. So just to summarize this, and now if I was speaking to policymakers or educators, I would say, well, this is something you have to think about. This is something you have to learn about. And it's our duty maybe to bring it out to them. But evolution can happen much more faster than previously believed. We have great importance of phenotypic plasticity. Just as an example, we have the evolution of terrestrial vertebrate life kicked off by a plasticity process. And we have the unappreciated role of non-genetic effects. And this focus on the phenotype, both as the nexus of the organism environment, but also as the outcome of complex processes of developmental systems, including symbiosis. And we will be hearing a lot about that in this meeting. So this is all about integration. And in particular, what we want to do in this presentation is also to bring in the need maybe to elevate the attention to information theory and semantics, or biosemiotics, that relate to how systems think, or how systems operate, how systems make their decisions. So let's move on maybe to that part, and just recapitulate the importance of biodiversity as being the foundation of systems. But without that, without diversity, there can be no connection of anything, and nothing can change. This is something that philosophers have been working with for thousands of years, as a fundamental thing. And we have to maybe not remind us here, because we are all aware of it, that this is happening across diverse biological scales, all the way from genes, molecules, up to global ecosystems. And that's how we need to connect these things. So, but also, sometimes these relations involve valuable information and difference in itself, you can say, and that's how the philosophers would put it. And so information is stored in the system, and this is a famous citation from Gregory Bateson, where he said, information is a difference that makes a difference. So when somebody has to explain to somebody that difference or diversity is valuable, then this is the citation I normally use. But we approach these living systems in a number of ways. And maybe not necessarily contrasting, but just sort of explaining these two different approaches, starting with what we can call the mechanical or machine-like approach, which is maybe the classical approach to us, humans standing beside nature, watching nature as a machine a little bit. And the thing is that in this kind of approach, we have a focus on units. So there's a unit functionality approach. So what happens between things in the system are less important for this approach. But of course, we are looking at a situation where this kind of mechanical approach can reveal a huge important information about function of certain genes or genes pathways, for example, that are important in disease or curing things. But what we want to draw attention to, that in this case, the environments of organisms or organismal things are often considered completely external. And secondly, the scientists themselves are external. So we are kind of watching the system. So this is a bit of a philosophical suggestion. So we call this a mechanical predictive model. But if we think about the organisms, excuse me, but then we move into a more conceptual approach, organic approach to systems, which is what we are doing. And I'm presenting some evidence of that momentarily. So here, in this kind of approach to look at systems, the primacy is on the processes, on the emergent properties. And often we identify these as being non-random, or even solving some solutions. So we often hear terms like self-creation, autopoiesis. Many of you, of course, are familiar with co-development and symbiotic, often referred to as symbiopoietic, when the organism is building it up from symbiotic processes. And here we have a very different view of the environment. And this is what I wanted to contrast mostly, is that the environment is tied to the organism. It's really defined as what the organism is sensing, interpreting, and acting on, influencing. And the scientist is a part of the system. So the scientist, as we see often now, and it's actually, I'm seeing this in the molecules to ecosystem philosophy, is to say we need to work more in nature, bring things into nature. That's an example of what I mean by that. So this citation to Simpson, the famous citation here, saying that organisms are really inseparable and environments are really inseparable. And this seahorse here is an example of that in our opinion. So environments are basically parts of living systems. That's the conclusion here. And this kind of processual view was synthesized quite nicely, in my opinion, in this opinion paper published last year by Sultan et al., where they bring in the concept of biological agency. So if you just look at the bold letters there and see that biological agency is defined in the capacity of a system to participate in its own persistence, maintenance and function by regulating its own structures and activities in response to the conditions it encounters. Notice, in response to the conditions. So that is what this sort of processual model of expecting things is meeting. What we are expecting differences like climate change, for example. And of course, this is building on an important person called Conrad Waddington. And I'm connecting him here, where he proposed a processual view of development and canalization, also called homoeresis, like a structured flow of things. That's how he looked at life. So in terms of the epigenetic landscape that he developed, he really said that if a developing system is disturbed, we can now imagine climate change or something else, it doesn't return to the original state, but to some other state of the process. So that's process philosophy for you right there. And his idol was actually Alfred North Whitehead, a famous process philosopher. So this is not some kind of a new development, but Waddington, of course, has been brought much more in. And I'm just throwing at you a few important, I would say, examples of citations of how people deal with these developmental systems, basically producing non-random variations. Non-random in the sense that plasticity, for example, creates adaptive solutions for an organism. And if you look at many organisms in a population that are being affected that way, they actually create non-random variation in the population. Like that's the term evolvability referring to, or even some kind of memory of past evolutionary history. So this is all based on this type of thinking and very, very valuable way of understanding how the world really operates. And we can also say that ecosystems work in the same way. It's not just developmental systems. They are structured and resilient. But of course, both developmental systems and ecosystems can go over a tipping point. And this is what is happening. They cannot respond to changes endlessly. And this is, of course, the problem we are fighting. And then maybe shifting gears a bit for sort of the last stretch of the presentation is to just emphasize the implicit process primacy in all of this, rather than focusing on units. Obviously, the units are important. But consider, for example, that systems can operate on different set of units. So units are interchangeable, like species are interchangeable in an ecosystem. So this then brings out the metaphor of the song that has been often used, or music is often used as a metaphor to present the process. It's the song, not the singer, which is the focus here. Some people would say that natural selection is acting on the song, on the processes that are happening. So it really indicates that there is some form of language or information processing going on, and even memory in the system. So this is just giving you some food for thought. And that's why we claim that we need to bring more information theory and understanding what is really going on when you talk like this. Like, how do we use the word signs and symbols and cross-talking and blah, blah, blah. We need to understand what do we mean by all of this. And the logic, I'm just presenting one example here of the logic of Charles Sanders Peirce. They call it triadic logic of approaching this. This is basically looking at the sign and the object and the interpretant. So a deer in the wood, for example, where there is a fire, sees a smoke and interprets the smoke as if there is a fire. Notice, interprets it, doesn't see the fire. And obviously it creates the phenotypic response of fleeing. We would call the fire squad, when this happens. But we can also take this kind of logic to understand the information in the system to the molecular level, as Scott Gilbert did in 2016 paper based on this biosemiotic theory, that we can have transcription factors arriving to the enhancer as completely meaningless signs, but the enhancer of the DNA interprets this and either activates or silences gene activation. That's a very broad example, possibly relating to some chemical or environmental stimuli that has occurred. But then also, this is all contextual. Depends on at the life states of the organism, the context of where that cell is at any given time. So I could of course go into much more details here, but it's all about complex contextual thinking. That's how we need to really develop our work. And I just draw your attention, I'm kind of advertising this also here. I draw your attention to this book on biosemiotics by Jesper Hofmeyr from 2008, and the semiotic agency, which is kind of also relating to this agency concept that I brought up earlier. It's just recently been published by this crowd. So there's a whole crowd of biosemiotics out there that is very little connected with many of the things we are doing. But then bring things a little bit home and come to Iceland. And show you an example of an ecosystem which has developed on its natural own terms, as is now demanded by the COP15 agreement. This is a complete wasteland that was made available 100 years ago by a retreating glacier in southeast Iceland, and it's been researched heavily. And now, as you can see in the last picture below, it's a thriving ecosystem built on its own kind of systemic processes, if you like. So this is just to illustrate the point. But we are maybe more familiar with examples of individual plasticity, especially the example of the Daphnia that I'm just going to mention here, which is of course famous for changing its phenotype in a kind of adaptive way by receiving chemical signals from the predator in the environment. It doesn't see the predator, but it interprets this meaningless signal that there is a predator. So it's bringing in kind of the semiotic thinking here. And the other example I want to maybe illustrate there, and I really draw your attention to this paper also by Fenwick, is the spadefoot toad there on the right, where you have the toads are responding either to being predatory or omnivore and really directly changing their phenotype within generations that way. So I can't finish this presentation without bringing in also the EMBL Iceland connection, which is kind of somewhat summarized in this, because it was really Edith that suggested in a meeting we had 3 years ago that we should really look at Iceland as a case study. So I'm using that terminology here. Islands are case studies of rapid evolution, rapid diversification. And we know from textbooks that rapid evolution is the way to understand processes. I mean, that's why Darwin did his discoveries in the Galapagos. And there are many reasons why islands are like this. If they are isolated, in Iceland, there are only 5 species of freshwater fish. In Scandinavia, there are 50. So obviously, there's a lot of within species diversifications, and Iceland being volcanic on top of this, and with very complex oceanic currents and God knows what, there are lots of habitat diversities and resource diversities. And my colleagues, Kalina and Marina, will bring this up later on, you will notice. And so I'm not going to go into any details of our research there, but we are studying the diversification of mostly of Arctic char and also of three-spined stickleback. We now know that this kind of diversification is occurring in many more organisms in Iceland, but it has been studied in details in these creatures. So we have this founding population of char coming 10,000 years ago into Iceland, evolving into different resources, and we now have evidence that the original states there in the beginning is really very much based on plasticity and maternal effects, whereas reproductive isolation kicks in later on. And in some cases, one case in particular, we have evolution of reproductive isolation and even speciation occurring. And the best known example of this, and you will hear more about this later, so I'm not going to go into any of the background research on these 4 different morphs of Arctic char, which are clearly resource-based adaptations, remember, organisms and the environment, connected because there is absolutely no competition with other fish species in the lake, so they had it all for their own in 10,000 years. So they have adapted, and in fact, these benthic morphs, which are the first top ones, are adapted to the benthic environment, feeding on benthic organisms, whereas there we have piscivorous morph and planktivorous morphs operating more in the open water. So it's a great example of an organism environment resource-based adaptive processes, but obviously involving all the things that I mentioned, plasticity and non-genetic effects and genetic diversifications and so forth. So it's just to sort of illustrate to you the example. And of course, ask you all to come to Iceland to work with us on these systems in the future, or you can find lots of them elsewhere as well. So it's not like some kind of a advertisement for Iceland. So here we see another example, a way of bringing this in, and maybe the purpose of bringing this in here is that if you think about these within species diversifications, they're really controlling the ecosystem. Ecosystem function here is really based on this, and ecosystem responses. And the Des-Rogers graph there to the right is actually a meta-analysis of how within species diversification of this kind and other kind is equally important, or more important even, for ecosystem function as between species. So here we're obviously challenging the classical policy strategies of only looking at species differences. And I encourage you to really look into this Des-Rogers paper on that, and very relevant for the policymakers at least. But in the spirit of combining ecosystem and development, the detailed studies that we've been doing on the developmental systems sort of causes of this the diversification. I'm just showing you this slide here, and it's almost coming to an end now. We now know that these evolutionary processes of the derived benthic morph on the bottom there, the last benthic, is a pedomorphic evolution, so retention of embryonic characters of the ancestors. And these processes have a lot to do with ossification of bones, the red color in this cleared and stained embryo. It's only 2 or 3 millimeters long there on the right. And so it's a cartilage is the blue, the red is ossification processes of the jaws. And it's obviously the jaw structures which are most important here. And we know now that this is a concert of gene regulation and influence from both internal, including maternal effects, and external environmental effects. So it's like a concert of developmental systems. That's the notion I want to give you, and you will hear more about this later from Kalina, I believe, in particular. And but the slide on the side is to say that we have this kind of adaptations in several other species of fish, like these benthic limnetic kind of diversifications. And the purpose of throwing that up here is that he was relating this in this paper, Kevin Parsons, to developmental bias. So basically showing that developmental bias in these systems of cichlids, of sticklebacks, of char is happening at all different stages of divergence. So again, it is suggesting really that it's a sunk. It's the process of these diversification that is important, not the players, not the units themselves. At least we need to think of them in concert. So I hope you understand what I'm trying to say here. But I said earlier that very few people were applying this kind of approach, like Evo-Devo approach has only very, very recently been proposed to be important for policymaking for biodiversity. But there's a very interesting paper here by Campbell et al. In 2017 that I'm drawing your attention to, where this diagram, as you can see, is kind of illustrating in what way they would like to talk to policymakers. But most importantly of all, and I will sound like a priest when I say this, is to reconnect with nature. And this very good, famous French ecologist just published this book just a couple of weeks ago, Nature That Makes Us Human. And it's a perfect reading to understand why this is important for our sciences and for society. And I also want to include the citation here to Edith in Nature last year, where she said, molecular biologists, let's reconnect with nature. So this is not just some kind of a romantic statement, you know, to go back to nature in some romantic sense, but also go back there because we can do better science that way. And I mentioned EMBL Iceland relations, and that's why I want to conclude with this slide here to tell you about that. We have this network developed in Iceland called Biodice, Biodiversity Iceland, and that network is focusing on all the issues that I've talked about, as you can see in this framework. But the important message here is that it was kicked off in a meeting with EMBL in 2020, in the fall, just when COVID was at its height. And during the meeting, Edith sort of stopped us and said, you know, up. You are telling me that Iceland is really a case study of biodiversity. And he said, okay. So a few weeks later, we had established this network, and now it's growing and thriving and doing all sorts of good things, I can tell you. We can talk more about that, but I urge you to check out the website, and you can also sign up for it. Many people here have done that, actually. Thank you. So thank you very much. And just want to end on this notion of process and the process philosopher that Waddington was reading, where he said basically everything flows, everything is connected. That's how we need to think. Life is complex, and that let's keep it that way. That's how we discover things. Thank you very much.